Hi, greetings. In this video, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things I've learned this summer by watching all kinds of YouTube videos. And I know I've talked about this before, that I've really gotten into watching all kinds of YouTube videos, but I really haven't shared what I learned. I learned numerous kinds of gardening styles. I learned about Back to Eden, which is where you use basically wood chips all over your ground to help drown out the weeds. I learned that some people use black plastic instead of wood chips. I learned about some people putting big tarps over their area where they're going to have a garden and leave it there all winter, so that by the next spring, the weeds have all been drowned out and won't grow. I've learned about hugelkultur, where you dig a deep trench and put logs and twigs and various wood things in the bottom, and then fill it up with greens and food scraps, and then a layer of mulch, and then dirt. And on top is dirt, and you could even put some wood chips or mulch of some kind on top of that. And it's like often in kind of a mound, and you plant on top of that. I've learned about trenching, where you dig a trench and just put in your wood scraps. Not your wood scraps, excuse me, your scraps from the kitchen. I've learned about square foot gardening, where you divide everything into 12-inch squares and plant in those squares. I've learned about microgreens. I've learned how to use grow lights, although I don't have any grow lights. I'm simply, now that I can't really garden outdoors anymore because of the fact that we've had several frosts, I have some plants growing in the house that normally would grow outside, and I'm going to basically use them as microgreens, because at this time of year, I don't necessarily want them to get full size. I've learned about using grow bags to plant in, as opposed to pots, about air pruning your roots in your plants. Oh gosh, I've even learned more things than that. I've learned a lot about people who homestead, learned how to butcher chickens, which I kind of already knew because we did that when I was growing up, although my dad's way of doing it was a lot more simple than what I watched on YouTube. We just simply took an axe and cut their heads off, and then singed the chicken to pluck out the feathers and the pin feathers and stuff like that. And my dad always raised a big garden, so I knew how he did it. I learned I learned about using Epsom salts. I learned about using fish manure, liquid fish manure, which I already knew about because my dad always used that faithfully. I learned how to use baking soda, and that, especially around my tomatoes, it made them sweeter. One thing I found, if I eat store-bought tomatoes, I get sores in my mouth. They just make my mouth break out. But I could eat the homegrown tomatoes, and they wouldn't do that. Only the store-bought ones, and I thought that was strange. But I think that it's because I made my tomatoes just a little sweeter. They weren't quite as acidy because of the way that I treated them. I learned about pruning the tomatoes, the little suckers off of the tomatoes as they grow, so that it puts more strength up into the actual fruit. I learned that a flower that I had, that I thought it was just a weed because it grows where I don't want it to, and just keeps on multiplying. But I learned that it's called a calendula, and that you can actually pick flowers and use them for tea and various other medicinal purposes. I already knew that you could eat dandelions, but I learned more about it. I learned that there are several weeds that grow in my garden that are actually edible, and I've been brave enough to actually try some of them. I grew a plant that I had never eaten before, arugula. I had never had it before, and so I grew some, and I discovered I like it a lot. I grew not coriander. Oh, what's the other name for coriander? Discovered that it's not necessarily, well, it looks a little bit like parsley, but it isn't. Cilantro. Discovered it's not my favorite, but my husband just bought a whole bag of it at the store for me to eat, so it'll work just fine in smoothies. I learned how to make all kinds of green smoothies, how to make them taste sweet by sticking some fruit in there. Gosh, there's a number of things that I learned. I'm just touching the tip of the iceberg here when I talk about what I've learned this summer. Well, not just this summer, but over the last few years when I've gotten more serious about my gardening. I learned how to make hoop tunnels for some of my cold hardy plants, so hopefully they overwinter. And I did it on the cheap, which is another thing that I kind of learned how you can do. You can spend all kinds of money on greenhouses and hoop tunnels and hoop tall and low, tall tunnels, low tunnels, boxes with glass or plexiglass over the top. Just numerous ways. I mean, there is no right or wrong way to garden because there are multiple ways. And what I've learned, what everybody says, do the method, the style that works for you. Because everybody's house, even if my gardening might be different from the next door neighbor, because the way the light hits, the way the trees make shadows, the way the sun shines down because of the position of the garden, everything makes a difference, and what works for one person might not work for another. I've learned so many different things, and as time goes on, as I try some of the things, when I get back outdoors in the spring, I'd like to do some lessons on how some of the things I've tried are working, how to do them. I know there's all kinds of lessons already on YouTube about how to do things, but it's always good for someone else's point of view. And each YouTuber, each YouTube channel has its own set of people who watch. And so I'm excited about learning and all that I've learned. And over time, I'd like to share some of what I've learned. I learned what is involved in becoming a master gardener. I decided I don't need a certificate to know that I know how to garden. And I don't necessarily have time to go out and volunteer in other people's gardens. And I don't really want to drive to my local OSU extension agency to take a class where I have to pay to take the class. I like to be a self-learner. And so the certificate is unimportant. I already know how to work in teams, leadership, how to put together presentations, I learned that in order to be a teacher, and then some of you may know I'm an avid Toastmaster, and that's what you work on in Toastmasters also, is leadership and presentations, learning how to organize your thoughts. So today I just wanted to make this, well, it was going to be a short video, but I see I've talked for 10 minutes already, and that's longer than a Toastmaster speech usually, so I think I better stop while I'm ahead and just tell you to have a wonderful day. Happy gardening.